Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about these two swords right here. These are Windlass Spartacus swords, and I'm going to set one down because I'm uncoordinated with two of them in my hands. Now, the Windlass Spartacus sword, these are one second hand and have diminished in condition. They're a little rustier than you probably would get if you find them new, but I don't know that you can unless you find new old stock because these appear to be discontinued, have been for a long time. Also note, just whatever I say in this video is my personal thoughts and musings. I'm far from an expert in swords and certainly don't know very much about ancient swords like this is supposed to represent. Now, on that subject, I should note that I don't think this is in any way a historic iteration of a Sica, nor is it likely intending to be. It's a movie prop recreation. It's meant to be the sword from Spartacus, Blood and Sand, and I'll touch on how well I think they did on that in just a second. Just know it doesn't look like a historic Sica, at least as I'm able to find, and I don't necessarily know what qualifies a historic Sica. As far as I'm able to tell, they are usually maybe 20 inches on the high side in terms of length, and they tend to be more of a dagger or a very short sword. Now this is 24 inches, it's much larger. They also don't have this kind of gradually sloping curve. They tend to be a little bit, anyway, I guess I don't know what historically represents a Sica. I would just say that it's probably not this. If you happen to know more from a historic perspective, if this represents the shape of a Sica, throw it in the commentary down below, but I'm going to speculate that it does not. Mostly not just because it's a windlass interpretation, but because it's supposed to be a movie prop from the show Blood and Sand, or Spartacus, Blood and Sand, a TV show that aired about old Roman gladiators in Sparta. Well, anyway, I won't get into that. The point is, they were trying to recreate a prop from the show, and how well did they do that is really, I suppose, the question rather than is this a historic model. If it's not, then you might have to take issue with the show Spartacus as opposed to Windlass, who's recreating the kind of hero sword from the show. Anyway, that said, I don't see that this represents a historic piece, so if that was your aim, I wouldn't say you'd want to look for it. Not that you could necessarily easily buy one, but if you're a fan of the show, then perhaps this is in your wheelhouse. In terms of how well does it do, in terms of recreating the show, from the photos that I'm able to find, it actually does a pretty good job. It looks pretty spot on, and in fact, the agedness of this particular iteration, the one that I have has rust and little bits and stuff like that on it, and that honestly kind of matches a little better with the show. The ones that have are grimy and used and have imperfections on them, which this one now does, and so does the other, so they tend to match actually a little bit better. Back in the day, these things sold for $285 for two of them. That's the only information I can really find about it in terms of what was advertised on Windlass's site. I could only speculate that they went for a little less than that retail when they were available. So in terms of two of them, you could get two for about $300. The only difference I really spot in terms of this to the show, and this is based on the photos that I'm able to see, it's tough to stop it in the show and find quality videos of it, but it doesn't have the same gap in the crossguard area that these two do. And in terms of manufacturing quality, both of the swords that I have are very similar. They, in terms of manufacturing quality, this is one positive that I can give to Windlass. Not only does it look the part of the piece in the show, but it also, they're manufactured very similar. They both weigh 2 pounds, 7.9 ounces. They both have very similar points of balance at about 3.5 inches. All the lengths and all of that are remarkably similar. So if you find an example of this, based on the two examples I have that appear very, very similar, they seem quite good. But I suppose that's similarity to the piece in the show, and manufacturing consistency is really where my praise would end. One, not a historic example, can't really hold that against it given its intent, but as a sword, this is really dumb, and I will attempt to elaborate why as I go through the overall fit and finish. So the pommel's a little better than 2 inches. It has a metal spacer in between that separates the pieces of wood. It appears to be peened on, but I guess I don't know if this will twist or not, though I would speculate not. It doesn't seem to move around. The transition here lines up pretty muddy, and it looks like there's old glue residue that was likely applied from the factory because it's on both examples. This doesn't look like it was applied after the fact, so it looks a little mucky in terms of the transition. The hardwood is nice, and both of them appear to have similar finishing levels. There are ledges here, which I would say are less than good. You would ideally have it be smooth, but they're not so sharp that they bite my hands, and I don't know that anyone kind of palms this type of pommel. If I move on to the grip I would just want to say is big. When I say big, you can see my giant sausage hands leave room. This is like a two-handed sword almost. It's more comfortable, in fact, than some two-handed swords, but it's got room for two hands, which seems uncharacteristically large. I suppose that's the way it is in the show, but it still seems very big for a sword like this. The leather has held up pretty well, but one thing I want to point out I don't like is It's pretty much a circle down here. It transitions into an ovoid shape, but it's very big in my hands. And the shape of this grip just makes the sword want to escape my hands as I move them around. Now you're using them one-handed, it comes with two, and kind of that's the gladiator style of things, but just the way this sword fits in my hands honestly just seems like a grip breaker. If I were to thrust, which isn't necessarily what the point of this sword is, but just as I move it, it feels like as my hand slides, this crossguard area just breaks my grip apart. It's not shaped in such a way that I find it terribly conducive. Now I have very little experience with swords of this era and type, so I don't know how characteristic that is, but it seems silly that you would want the sword to break your grip. It feels like it's trying to pry my hands open gradually as I hold it. One of the least comfortable things about this sword in particular is the grip, not just because of the material used or the shape. It's not that necessarily. I would say it's a little big, but this tapering up and then meeting this ledge just makes me want to let go of the sword, and that's a bad thing to do with a sword. If I break out the second example here, both of them share kind of similar transitions, similar looks, similar problems. The crossguards look about the same too. There's a relatively sizable hole where the tang goes in that you can make out. In a sword of this price, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily problematic. Crossguard areas look pretty similar. They have reasonable hardwood that matches, and similar problems. Again, this metal ring in the center has a ledge, and it could be uncomfortable. It doesn't bite into my skin at all as I try to move these swords around somewhat. It's pleasant enough looking though, and reasonably well shaped. I'd venture a guess that this transition is probably not the way it's supposed to be, because I don't think swords were made to break your grip apart, but looks-wise, it's pleasant enough. Now the shape of the blade is quite large. This is a 24-inch sword. I don't see a lot of examples of swords of this type at 24 inches long, but it's not to say that swords of this era couldn't be that long. I guess I'm no expert in that, but it does seem uncharacteristic that they would look like this. Sometimes they would be crooked forward or have a different shape, but this is kind of an odd shape, and I don't know how historic it is or isn't. Again, in terms of representation from the film, it's about right. The other thing I want to point out is there's almost no distal taper in this blade, or really taper up until it switches up to this pointed swoopy area here. But it's a very thick blade, and that gets to my second complaint, that this is not a fun sword to move around. Not only does the grip make it want to fly out of my hand, the point of balance is relatively low at 3.5 inches above the cross, which should make it feel lively, but it doesn't. It's clumsy in the hand, and I think that's because it wants to fly out of my hand, but in general it's a very heavy, hefty sword to move, so it's not a particularly fun one to move. In terms of the blade, it has the conventional windlass problems, you might say, though to a slightly lesser extent. I don't notice huge amounts of rippling in the flats. The center line does move around ever so slightly. This example is obviously made of carbon steel because it's gotten some rust on it. The tip goes to a very fine point, and I've heard a couple people say in various forums that this deforms relatively easily, so they don't know what level of tempering it does or doesn't have. But shape-wise, it certainly represents the piece in the show. This one's been sharpened. It has a very pronounced secondary bevel. Again, a common thing with windlass, they don't seem to come sharpened. I don't know if that's a legal restriction based on where they're shipping from, so they often get a secondary sharpening service, which is a relatively inexpensive thing, usually $20 to $30 to $50, and the result is you get a big giant secondary bevel. But hopefully that's all you need to have a little bit of backyard shenanigans with a sword like this. It does seem like it's a sturdy sword, to its credit, but it dynamically is just not fun to move whichever way I turn this sword. It just wants to break my grip. It wants to come out of my hands. And both of the examples, if I break either one out, seem to have the same effect on my grip. It doesn't feel like a comfortable sword to use. The grip feels too big. It feels tip heavy despite its lower point of balance given the size, and it feels clubbish. It feels like a terrible sword in my hand. So while they did represent the piece in the show, I would venture a guess that the show swords were probably made out of a lighter material that didn't wear on the actors as much. The grips do seem similar to the props in the photos I'm able to see, so to that end, they've done a good job. But in terms of making a comfortable to use weapon for fun, I would say this is anything but. Wanting to break my grip and wanting to murder my shoulders as I move it around is not a fun experience for me while I'm trying to move a sharp sword around. Anyway, I think Windlass did hit the mark when it came to representing a piece from the TV show. The gold doesn't seem to be representing a piece from history, and so hopefully buyers aren't confused by that, by thinking they're getting a piece that's going to represent a sword from antiquity as opposed to a movie prop, a fantasy-esque kind of piece. Anyway, if you have more information about what might have been used in the good old times of Spartacus, or what might have been used in the arena beyond this, if you have a better idea of what a Sica is supposed to be, then throw that in the commentary down below. Anyway, that's all I've got for you. Hopefully you liked the video. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.